Thank you, Jane and Haley and Savannah from Stewardship Center. Yeah, otters, great animals. So next up, we have Dennis Staley. So we go from otters to landslides. I guess that's a concern. I mean, if there's a tsunami, I'll just stay right here. That's the safety talk. But next up, we have Dennis Staley. Going to talk about the progress in understanding landslide hazards in Prince William Sound, Alaska, and we've all been aware of the Barrier Arm landslide, and so we'll be hearing about that. Welcome, Dennis.
Great, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, excellent. So I'll notify you when it's time to advance. Sounds good. All right, so I'm Dennis Staley. I'm the project lead at the USGS for a large interagency effort that's aimed at advancing our understanding of landslide hazards out in Prince William Sound. And so while you see my name up there on this title slide, there's a number of people, greater than 30, at the State of Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys, the Alaska Earthquake Center, and the National Tsunami Warning Center, who have all contributed to this talk. So I want to acknowledge them right off the bat. Next slide, please. So oh, sure, of course. Yeah, I'll just step forward maybe 3 more inches. Okay, great. So we're all here largely because of the Barrier Arm landslide is how this science effort started. So in the recognition of the hazard back in 2019. So the Barrier Arm landslide is located out in the northwest corner of Prince William Sound, about 50 kilometers from here. And it's a large, slowly deforming landslide that we've been able to measure the rates at which it's moving over the past decade, couple decades. So looking back from 1999 to 2008, it was kind of at a background level of about 1.5 meters per year. With the recession of the Barrier Glacier between 2010 and 2013, it really accelerated. And so we saw rates on the order of about 26 meters per year. From 2014 to 2016, it slowed down a little bit, and we're seeing rates about 10 meters per year. I'm sorry, go back one. Thank you. And then once we did some more rigorous monitoring starting in 2001, we saw rates on the order of about 3 meters per year in both 2021 and 2022, with minimal movement in 2021. So it's a very large landslide, about 1.5 miles wide and about 3,000 feet high. And our initial estimates of modeling suggest that should that thing fail catastrophically, so if the entire landslide failed at a very high mobility, we could anticipate a wave in Whittier somewhere on the order of about 2 meters out in Passage Canal, just offshore. Next slide, please. So we've got a very focused monitoring effort out in Barrier Arm, and we want to make sure that people know what it is that we're seeing. And we do this through our friends at the State of Alaska, their website at DGGS. And so every month in kind of normal periods when the landslide is behaving well, we'll provide a monthly update on that website as to what it is that we're seeing and any relevant field activities. Should the landslide increase in the amount of deformation that we're seeing and we start getting a little more nervous, we will update that website much more frequently than that, typically on the order of about once a week. So the relevant web pages are on the slide here, and I'll get to them again at the end of the presentation. But I encourage you all to visit those sites and to also sign up for the list, the email list, where you can get emails directly to you in your inbox whenever it is we provide updates on that site. So the status of the landslide today is that we're not seeing any widespread signs of deformation. So nothing of concern at this very moment. Now that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a big regional earthquake and shake things loose. So there's always a hazard out there, but as of right now, we're not seeing any detectable movement at the Barrier Arm landslide. Next slide, please. So scaling back a little bit and thinking more about the broader science and the bigger implications of what it is we're trying to accomplish out in the Sound, we're trying to answer 3 very fundamental questions. And so what would cause the Barrier Arm landslide or other slow moving landslides that are out in the Sound to accelerate and fail catastrophically? What is the hazard and risk associated with a catastrophic failure? And then how can we best inform the public of these hazards and reduce risk? And so I was lucky enough to present here last year, and that was largely on the 3rd question that we were asking, and we'll have an opportunity to talk more with you all later today at the tabling session. So we're just going to focus on the first 2 points here. And if you could advance that 2 clicks, please. Thanks. And so to do that, we ask 4 more even basic questions. And for the rest of this slideshow, I'm going to kind of work my way through each of these 4 questions that we're asking. But this is where, when, why, and how. Next slide, please. So really fundamental to our research is where are existing and new landslides. We know that they're out there. We're well aware of the Barrier Arm landslide, but we know there are other landslides out in the landscape. Next slide, please. We can do this in a combination of ways that allows us to develop a geospatial inventory. So we can identify where in the landscape specifically we see evidence of landslide activity or deformation. So pretty easy to do optically or visually. We can look at photos from pilots flying by. We've got this beautiful superglacial landslide out in the valley up above the Barrier Arm landslide. We can see it in satellite photos. We can look out the window and see it across the fjord, just on the other side of the Passage Canal. And so from these visual observations, we can assign a location to those, make some estimates of how big they might be, and start thinking about why they are distributed where they are. Next slide, please. Some things you don't see all that well, and so you have to rely upon different data sources. In this case, we're using satellites to measure deformation over a period of a number of years. So you can see from space when things are slowly creeping along. And so we're able to do this at a regional scale, and we're able to identify landslides that are slowly deforming, but maybe we don't see that deformation, and we're certainly not in the field measuring those yet. Next slide, please. So the subaerial landslides, those that we can see above the water, attract most of our attention. And so we have these beautiful landscapes out in Prince William Sound, these big, huge, massive hill slopes that are very steep. And you see these scars and cracks and cliffs and these things that are associated with landslides. But if we click one more time, please, we can use data that NOAA is collecting out in the Sound, very high resolution bathymetric data, so the topography of what's under the water. And we can see, oh, wow, there's a lot of landslides underneath the water. And so we're concerned about these because these are the types of landslides that caused a lot of damage during the 1964 earthquake. And so if we can better understand where they are, where they're initiating, how big they are, we can do a better job of constraining the hazard. Next slide, please. So now that we've found where the landslides are, we can think about the timing of these landslides and when they start moving and how fast they're moving when they are moving. Next, please. So what we've been focused on at Barrier Arm for much of the last year plus is a ground-based radar instrument that's on the opposite side of the fjord, pointed directly at the landslide. And from this instrument, it slides back and forth on a rail. And every 10 minutes, we can image the landslide and start detecting sub-centimeter changes in the surface. So very, very small amounts of deformation. We can aggregate that over a day and see how the landslide's behaving over time. So this is the picture of the ground-based radar. It's housed in that enclosure on the left. We also have a 42 megapixel camera that's taking several pictures a day. It's powered by the sun and then transmitting data by Wi-Fi. Next slide, please. So this is what the data look like when we're not so concerned about widespread landslide deformation. When you see green, that's indicative of little to no movement. And these, when we log in each morning and take a look, this is what we like to see. So lots of green and maybe a few spots of different colors that are just normal processes that you would expect in a steep ice-cored landscape. Next slide, please. So when we start seeing movement, and I'm going to walk through a period of motion that we detected in August, September, and October of last year, we logged in one morning and started seeing colors in the yellows and oranges. So somewhere around 20 to 25 to 30 millimeters per day of movement on this feature that we refer to as the kite, sort of in the upper left corner of the landslide. Next slide, please. A few days later, we logged in and the whole landslide is now moving. We're not seeing the more benign yellows and oranges anymore. We're down into the purples and pinks and purples. So we're looking at rates on the order of about 75 to 100 millimeters per day throughout much of the landslide. Next slide, please. A little bit later on in the month, this is at Halloween of last year, we could start to breathe a bit of a sigh of relief because now the landslide is slowing down. And so we're not seeing those 100-ish millimeter per day rates anymore. Now we're back towards maybe 5 or 10 millimeters per day. So widespread deformation is slowing down. We can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief. And then finally, next slide. And then we're back to that state of quiet, and the landslide no longer is moving at any widespread capacity. So these are the types of measurements that we're able to make. And so while it's important to know how they're moving and at what rates, what we really want to know is why it's going to move, or if it has the chance to fail catastrophically when we do see this acceleration. So we want to continue working through our questions to be able to address that broader question that we have. Next slide. So we're able to confirm the measurements that we're making from the ground-based radar and make these same measurements in other locations using data from the satellite. I talked a little bit about this earlier. And so if we look back at that series of movement that we saw in Barry Arm, we can say that, yeah, the satellite data, while the rates may be slightly different because of various factors like the way the satellite is looking at the landscape, the period over which it's making those measurements, we can say that the broad patterns that we're seeing from space and the broad rates are in general agreement with what we're seeing at the radar. So we can confirm those measurements and we can make sure they're real. Next slide, please. Our friends at DGGS have this really nifty instrument that they can mount on a fixed wing or a helicopter and send out every few months and get a very detailed picture of how much the landslide has moved over that period of time. This is an airborne LiDAR system that they maintain in-house. And it helps also better constrain the measurements that we're making on the Barry Arm landslide using the radar and the satellite. So we have multiple lines of evidence that suggest that, yes, the landslide did move. We can constrain very precisely the time over which it moved, and then we can do our best to inform other models of landslide deformation from these data. Next, please. And then finally, when is the landslide moving? So we can see over time how it's moving and how fast, but should there be an event, we can use geophysical methods to detect a rock fall or a catastrophic failure or a partial failure of the landslide. So here we're on the picture on the upper left, we have an infrasound array that acquires the acoustic signal that would be emitted from a rock fall event or a small landslide or a big landslide. We also have seismometers that detect the shaking of the earth that would be correspondent with a mass movement. So one click, please. If you look closely, you'll see there's a rock fall in one of the images that we're acquiring at the camera. This was in October of 2021. And next slide, please. Thank you. We have the seismic signal associated with that event. So then we can very precisely time when we're seeing activity on the landslide itself, and we can use that at Barry Arm or for other regional landslides. Next slide. So we've looked very closely at Barry Arm, and we started finding other landslides across the Sound. So now, why are there landslides in some places but not others? And so now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of the geology. Next slide, please. So we think about the geologic history and the structure of the geology. So how that material was deposited, how it was metamorphosed, how it was uplifted, all of these things cause stresses within the bedrock itself, and those stresses express themselves as cracks and fractures and discontinuities and joints, all of which can potentially control how susceptible a slope is to landslide failure. And so our colleague Sean Lahusen is measuring the bedding planes and the discontinuity angles and spacing in the rocks in Prince William Sound. Next slide, please. And the folding and faulting also play a big role. So we have the very fine scale cracks and joints and discontinuities, but we also have these bigger, more regional types of characteristics that are expression of the tectonic history of the area. Next slide, please. So another important control of the geology on why we're seeing landslides in certain places over others are the material properties. My colleague Lauren Schaefer is using a hand spectrometer, which can measure the spectral characteristics of what's ever on the surface and give you some idea of the mineralogy. how that material weathers, how it might behave when it fails. My colleague Bill Schultz on the right-hand side is using a ring shear device to test how material behaves as you apply stress to it. Some material gets gains strength as you shear it, others weakens, and sometimes you see sort of a combination of both. And so when you understand how that material behaves as stress is applied, you can better understand whether or not it has a potential to fail rapidly. And from that, we can start making better estimates of hazard. Next slide, please. Another conditioning type of process that we'll see in the landscape that controls why we're seeing landslides in certain places than others is the glacial history. So we think about rapid glacial recession and debuttressing and how that may destabilize slopes, but we also have to think about the longer landscape evolution, how many glacial cycles there have been, how that's damaged the rock. All of these things in the glacial history that could potentially control the susceptibility of those slopes to landsliding. Next slide, please. We also have potential triggers that happen more regularly. We have regional earthquakes that could shake material loose. We have prolonged rainfall. All of these hydrometeorological conditions that introduce water to slopes or rapid temperature changes, all of these things could be potential triggers for landslide initiation or the onset of deformation. And so we're actively measuring all of those things to try to relate when we're seeing movement to these environmental factors. Next slide, please. So we want to take all of this information to better understand how these landslides move and how would they potentially fail. Next slide. So we do this through an integrative analysis and a lot of modeling. And so we're just getting started with a lot of this work. It takes a long time to build up the data you need to do these types of analysis to understand the differences across the landscape. And once you have this sort of background information or this fundamental database, you can start thinking more broadly about the stability of the slopes, how these things might fail. And so we take our inventory data, the kinematics that of the landslide that we've learned from monitoring from both space and the ground. We think about the environmental conditions, we apply shear stress to the material, and we start thinking about the geology. And we can put all of these things into a number of slope stability models that can say, what's a plausible mechanism by which a landslide would fail? And we admittedly have a very long way to go before we'll be able to answer that question. Next slide, please. So I want to take a minute here just to acknowledge again that this is not just me up here. There's a huge team of scientists behind me that's providing this information. So we've got all the agencies that are involved in this effort up there. But what I really want to do is take just a brief moment to thank everybody that's in this room, the members of this community, the businesses that have helped us out. We have to work under all these rules and regulations as government employees doing travel and contracting. And the people here have just been incredibly, incredibly supportive. So I want to just take a quick moment to thank you all for that. And so while our efforts have been focused largely on northwestern Prince William Sound and Whittier, we are expanding this summer to start thinking about the landscape between Valdez and Cordova, and then we'll kind of work our way south and back west the following summer. So with that, I want to say thank you to all. You can put it in the next slide. And again, all of the links and web resources you might want. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have now or wait till 1 o'clock where we have our tabling session, and happy to answer them there. Thank you.
I want to do one question and we're going to go behind. So, yeah, thanks. Do you see
Yeah, so the question is, are there seasonal patterns of movement? And we've only been carefully monitoring the landslide for 3 years now, and we've seen that there has been movement in the late summer in both 2020 and 2021, spanning about the same period of time. Relating that back to what that potential triggering mechanism might be still requires some work. Thanks.